first of a series of talks titled The Saints Inspire Us to Follow Christ. Over the few weeks, I'll be recording presentations on various saints as we commemorate their feast days. And so today, I want to tell you a story of two amazing saints and their unbelievable courage. Now, some of you might remember that from my interview with Father Nolan that I was a history major in college, so it's fitting that he asked me to record these historical presentations. This past Monday, June 22nd, we celebrated the feast of St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher. They both share a feast day. Thomas More was a lawyer and John Fisher was a bishop. Now, John Fisher was born in 1469, the son of a moderately prosperous merchant. What that means is that in 15th century England, his family was probably able to provide for everything they needed, but they weren't considered nobility. Nonetheless, his family was able to send him to Cambridge University around the age of 14. He completed his studies and he was ordained a priest in 1491 at the age of 22. This was actually younger than the canonical age at the time, so he had to obtain a papal dispensation to be ordained so young. Incidentally, John Fisher was also elected a fellow at his college the same year he was ordained, and young Prince Henry, later to be King Henry VIII, was born the same year. In 1497, still in his 20s, John Fisher became the personal chaplain and confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort. That's a name you probably might not know. She was the mother of King Henry VII. She actually outlived Henry VII by a few months. So she was Henry VIII's grandmother. Now, through Henry VII's patronage, John Fisher was appointed Bishop of Rochester in 1504. That's a position he held for the rest of his life. That same year, he was also appointed Chancellor at the University of Cambridge, and he also became a tutor to young Prince Henry, a boy of about 13. Bishop Fisher was so prominent at the English court that he was called upon to deliver the eulogies for both King Henry VII and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, both of whom died in 1509. Now, I tell you all of this just to illustrate how connected John Fisher was to Henry VIII. Meanwhile, back in Europe, as we know, the Protestant revolt was launched in 1517 when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. And among the things that Martin Luther was objecting to was the idea of papal authority and the church's teaching on indulgences. Now, in reply, Henry VIII authored a response to Martin Luther known as the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, which just means defense of the seven sacraments. This work was dedicated to Pope Leo X, who rewarded the king with the title Defender of the Faith. That's a title that every English monarch has claimed to this very day, even though Pope Paul III revoked it in 1530. Now, while Henry himself was fairly well educated, it is believed by some that he had help drafting this response to Martin Luther, and that the help he got was from none other than the two saints we're talking about today, John Fisher and Thomas More. Now, you've probably also heard that Henry VIII sought to break from Rome so that he could divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, in hopes of producing a male heir. Henry and Catherine together had only one child who had survived infancy, and that was the Princess Mary. Now, while England never had a law forbidding a girl from inheriting the crown, Henry's own father, Henry VII, had come to the throne after a series of bloody dynastic battles and struggles that had plagued England throughout much of the 15th century. So Henry VIII really wanted to secure his own family's hold on power. He wanted to do that by ensuring that he had a male heir. So, since he wanted to break from Catherine, he petitioned the Vatican for a declaration of nullity regarding his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Now, I'm not going to focus on the merits of Henry's claim, but based on all the evidence back then and everything produced since, it was pretty clear that Henry had no valid grounds to divorce Catherine. Accordingly, his petition was ultimately denied, which led Henry to break from Rome and declare himself head of the church in England and to wed Anne Boleyn. Now, at that time, Henry got the Parliament to adopt what was called the Act of Supremacy, and that established Henry as the head of the church in England, both Henry and all of his heirs from that day forward. And when that happened, he sought to have everyone in England agree that that was actually the law of the land. Now, during the time that Henry was trying to divorce Catherine, there was a trial set up, a divorce trial that Henry had set up, and Bishop John Fisher, argued the defense case for Catherine. He took a cause before the court. And at that defense, John Fisher declared, with Henry VIII right there in attendance, that he was prepared to die, just like St. John the Baptist, to defend the indissolubility of marriage, including Henry's marriage to Catherine. So shortly after this trial, which did not grant Henry his annulment, the case was transferred to Rome, and John Fisher's official involvement with the case ended. But he had made a permanent enemy in Henry. Now, as I said, Henry had gotten Parliament to adopt the Act of Supremacy in 1534. And it's one thing for Henry to get that law on the books, but it was another thing to get universal acceptance across England. But Henry did pressure Parliament to not only recognize him as head of the Church of England, but also to recognize the validity of his marriage to Anne Boleyn and the legitimacy of all of their children. And refusal to accept any of these would have been considered treason, and the penalty for treason at that time across Europe was death. Now, Bishop Fisher refused to sign anything recognizing Henry's claim, either about his marriage to Anne Boleyn or his supremacy over the church. So Henry had him tried for treason, and he was convicted and sentenced to beheading. Now, Henry knew that the feast of the Nativity of John the Baptist was June 24th, and Henry did not want there to be any linkage between John Fisher's beheading and the beheading of John the Baptist. So he decreed that the beheading should take place before June 24th. So John Fisher was beheaded on June 22nd, 1535, which is still the day we recognize as the feast of St. John Fisher. Now I'm going to shift to St. Thomas More. He's probably the saint you're more likely familiar with. And his is another extraordinary tale of great moral courage. His story from the famous play or the movie A Man for All Seasons. Thomas More was born in 1478 to a lawyer, a man who later became a judge. He was educated at Oxford. He was admitted to the bar as a lawyer in 1502. He later served in Parliament, at one time actually serving as the Speaker in Parliament. And he was appointed to King Henry VIII's Privy Council. That's a very, very close council of advisors to the king. And he served as a personal secretary to King Henry. So Henry and Thomas really became very close friends. Now, after the Lord High Chancellor of England, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, and he had been the Chancellor from since 1515, after he was unable to get Henry the divorce that Henry wanted, Henry removed Cardinal Wolsey as the Chancellor in 1529, and he installed his good friend Thomas More as the new Chancellor. But Thomas More himself had been among the court officials who would not sign Henry's initial petition for annulment, since he believed the marriage to Catherine was valid and thus indissoluble. Now, when the English bishops, excluding John Fisher, signed their acceptance of Henry's decree of his supremacy over the church, and of course, his marriage to his marriage to Anne Boleyn, Thomas More also declined to sign that declaration. But he remained silent. He didn't say anything publicly about it at all. Nonetheless, he chose to resign his position as Chancellor the very next day. Shortly soon thereafter, however, Thomas More was accused of opposing Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, and Thomas More was compelled to appear and explain himself. Again, he refused to acknowledge the validity of Henry's new marriage or Henry's claim of supremacy over the church. So Thomas More went one step further, though. He also refused to recognize Henry's children by Anne Boleyn as legitimate heirs to the throne. And this was more than the king could tolerate. So Thomas was also tried and convicted of treason, and he was sentenced to death. He was beheaded on July 6, 1535, exactly 2 weeks after John Fisher. Now, John Fisher and Thomas More were two men who had risen to the top of their respective careers. John Fisher was a bishop, and right before his death, he had been made a cardinal by Pope Paul III. Thomas More, as Chancellor of England, was the second most powerful person at court after the king himself. So each of these men had everything to lose and nothing temporal to gain by refusing to sign Henry's decrees. Of course, they had their souls to save. Now, Henry's power was so great that no one else in England, except for Catherine herself, Queen Catherine of Aragon, and Princess Mary, no one else refused to sign the declarations of Henry's supremacy over the church or to recognize his marriage to Anne Boleyn. And Henry made both Catherine's and Mary's lives absolutely miserable. Mary never, ever, ever rested easy until the day she came to the throne herself in 1553. But John Fisher and Thomas More were the political and legal equivalent of commoners, and they were folks that Henry could afford to abuse. In fact, their martyrdom served a useful purpose for Henry. It allowed the king to show everyone in England that he meant business about his claims, and he would make no exceptions for anyone refusing to accept his claims, even for the closest of his friends, which is the case with Thomas More. So John Fisher and Thomas More certainly were great profiles in courage, but why are their stories relevant for us today? Well, how many times do we hear in the news about those who preach traditional Christian teachings about morality, sexuality, morality, abortion, that these folks are spreading bigotry? Ask yourself this question. Have you ever at work or in a social setting been afraid to admit you accept the church's teachings on these hot button topics for fear you'll be perceived as sort of out of touch, the odd man out? Or worse, do you fear that you might even lose your job? My friends, the same pressures that John Fisher and Thomas More faced exist today, right here in our immediate world. Now, in the Gospel of St. John, our Lord tells us that because you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. How much do we see this today? And yet, what our Lord asks of us is to remain ever faithful to his church and his truths. As we heard in the Gospel of Matthew earlier this week, Jesus tells us, everyone therefore who acknowledges me before others, I also will acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I also will deny before my Father in heaven. Be truthful witnesses for his church and his truths. I thank you for listening to this first recorded message on the lives of the saints. Our next recording will be on St. John the Baptist, whose feast we celebrate on June 24th. And until then, God bless you and stay safe.